Okay, so we are now starting on the Civil War. We've covered the causes of the Civil War, and now we're going to talk about the actual war. So the war begins. Lincoln took office in March of 1861. In his inaugural address, he said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." So he made it very clear that the Civil War was not caused by the government. It was caused by the individuals in the South. But as Lincoln took office, that's when secession really kicked up. So Lincoln believed that secession was an illegal act and that the United States was a nation, not a collection of separate sovereign states. The Southerners, on the other hand, believed the states had freely joined the Union and therefore they could freely leave it. Their initial goal was to preserve the Union. So it wasn't about slavery for the Union. It was all about preserving the Union. Whereas the South, they made the whole purpose of the war slavery. At Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which is a federal fort in the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, it was cut off from vital supplies and reinforcements because it's in the middle of a southern city. Lincoln announced that he was going to send provisions of food to the fort to, help make sure that people stayed living in the federal fort. South Carolina said, no. They opened fire on April 12, 1861. It was attacked for 2 days and then ultimately captured by the Southerners. This united the Northerners behind a patriotic fight to save the Union. This is really the opening shots of the Civil War. Not really the first battle, but the opening shots of the Civil War. So President Lincoln, more than any other previous president, had drawn upon his powers as chief executive and commander-in-chief, often without, authorization or approval of Congress. So after Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to help put down the insurrection in the Confederacy. He authorized spending for a war, which, by the way, Congress controls the money, so that's a problem. He suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, which that means people don't necessarily have all of the legal rights that they had. And since Congress was out of session, the president acted completely on his own authority. He later explained that he had to do it because it was indispensable to the public safety. Historians debate whether or not that's actually true. Okay, so Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded from the Union early in 1861. The people of Western Virginia, however, remained loyal to the Union and ultimately became a separate state known as West Virginia in 1863. The Confederacy then moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia, making it a much closer capital to Washington, D.C. So 4 slaveholding states remained in the Union: Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky. The Union sentiment in these states, and there was shrewd federal policy to help keep the border states in the Union. The U.S. troops were placed in those states to help keep them under control, and keeping the border states was a primary military and political goal for Lincoln, because if the border states joined the Confederacy, then the Confederate population would increase by more than 50% and would have severely weakened the North's strategic position for conducting the war. So Lincoln was very, very worried about losing the border states. So if you look at the map here, you can see the blue states are Union states and territories. The gray is Union states that allowed slavery, so our border states. And then the red are Confederate states. So the Confederate military strengths and weaknesses, they had the advantage of having to only fight a defensive war in order to win. They had to move troops and supplies shorter distances than the Union did. They had a long indented coastline that made it really hard to blockade, and they had experienced military leaders and high troop morale. Now the Union, they had to conquer an area as large as Western Europe, and they hoped that the population of 22 million in the North would work to its favor in a war of attrition. So there were 800,000 immigrants that enhanced their population during the war, and emancipation in 1863 also brought 180,000 African Americans into the Union Army in the final years. They also had a loyal U.S. Navy, so pros and cons on both sides. As for economic strengths and weaknesses, the Confederacy hoped that European demand for its cotton would bring recognition to it and financial aid, and they pretty much counted on Europe to be successful, and that ultimately bit them. The Union dominated the nation's economy and controlled most of the banking and capital, more than 85% of the factories, more than 70% of the railroads, and 65% of the farmland because of the territories. And the skills of the northern clerks and bookkeepers was really valuable for logistical support of the large military operations, because in order to have good logistical military operations, it really helps to have people who know how to work the books. As for political strengths and weaknesses, the Confederacy was struggling for its independence. States' rights was a liability because they needed a strong central government to win a war, but they didn't have that because every state was kind of for itself. They hoped that the people of the Union would turn against Lincoln and the Republicans, and then ultimately quit the war because it was too expensive to fight it. The Union was fighting to preserve the Union. They had a strong central government, strong public support, and they had experienced politicians. So all of those are big strengths for the Union. The Confederate States of America, as I said before, was modeled after the Constitution of the U.S. There was a 6-year term for president, which also gave the president an item veto, which is not in the U.S. Constitution, which means that he has the power to veto only part of a bill instead of the whole bill. They also denied the Confederate Congress the powers to levy a protective tariff. Remember, that was a big bone of contention, and to appropriate funds for internal improvements. So Congress wasn't allowed to do that either. They also prohibited the foreign slave trade. Unfortunately, the Confederate States were chronically short of money. They tried loans, income taxes, and the impressment of private property. And they issued more than $1 billion in paper money, which caused severe inflation. They tried to nationalize railroads, which encouraged industrial development, and had 1 million troops at its peak. President Jefferson Davis tried to increase his executive powers during the war, but Southern governors resisted the attempts at centralization, some holding back troops and resources in order to protect their own states. At one point, Vice President Alexander Stephens, in defense of states' rights, even urged the secession of Georgia from the Confederacy in response to the despotic actions of the Confederate government. By the end of the war, the value of a Confederate dollar was less than 2 cents. So the first major battle of the Civil War was the First Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas. It was in July of 1861. 30,000 Federal troops marched to attack the Confederate forces positioned near Bull Run Creek at Manassas Junction. Confederate reinforcements, led by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, attacked just as the Union forces seemed close to victory, which sent them into disorderly and panicky flight back to Washington, including the picnickers and civilian curiosity seekers who came to watch the battle. Not kidding, it was like a Sunday picnic there. It ended the illusion of a short war, and it promoted the myth that the rebels were invincible in battle. So this was strategically very good for the Confederates, not so hot for the Union. This image depicts the First Battle of Bull Run. So you can see it's very chaotic fighting, but even on the back hill, you can see the picnickers watching. So Union strategy in the beginning of the war was created by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, and it was a 3-pronged strategy. The Anaconda Plan, which was to use the U.S. Navy to blockade the southern ports, cutting them off from essential supplies. Taking control of the Mississippi River, which would divide the Confederacy in two, and raising and training an army of 500,000 to conquer Richmond. The first 2 parts were a lot easier to achieve than the third, and after the Union defeat at Bull Run, the Federal armies experienced a succession of crushing defeats as they attempted various campaigns in Virginia, each one less successful than the one before. General George B. McClellan became the new commander of the Union Army in the East, and he insisted on a long period of training before going into battle. This really tested Lincoln's patience. Lincoln was not a fan of this plan. Ultimately, Lincoln pushed McClellan into going and doing something. So McClellan invaded Virginia in March of 1862. And you can see that on the map there. It's known as the Peninsula Campaign. They went down around the peninsula and up to try to get to Richmond. The Union Army was stopped by Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and after 5 months, McClellan was forced to retreat and ordered back to the Potomac, where he was replaced by General John Pope. The Union went through a lot of generals to get to a good leader. So Robert E. Lee was the son of Revolutionary War officer Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee III. He was a top graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. He was an exceptional officer and military engineer in the U.S. Army for 32 years. He became distinguished from the Mexican-American War, and then he served as the superintendent of West Point. He then chose to follow his home state in April 1861 when they seceded, and he served as a senior military advisor to Jefferson Davis, and ultimately became the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia from 62 to 65. He was the de facto leader of the Confederate Army. He was offered lead of the Union armies early in the war, and then that's when he decided to go with his state. He did not want to fight against his family. At the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, Lee took advantage of the change in Union generals to strike quickly at Pope's army in Northern Virginia. He drew Pope into a trap, he struck the enemy's flank, and then sent the Union army backward to Bull Run. Pope ultimately withdrew back to Washington again. After the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee started leading his army into Maryland. The Union Army intercepted the invading Confederates at Antietam Creek in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Disappointed with McClellan for failing to pursue Lee's weakened and retreating army, Lincoln removed him for a final time as the Union commander. The president complained that his general had a, quote, bad case of the slows. So, Antietam was the bloodiest single day of combat in the war. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in one day. Lee couldn't break through the Union lines, and he ultimately retreated to Virginia. It was technically a draw on the battlefield, but Antietam proved to be a decisive battle because the Confederates failed to get what they so urgently needed: open recognition and aid from a foreign power. On the other hand, Lincoln found enough encouragement in the results of Antietam to claim a Union victory, which Lincoln then used politically. So if you look at this map, you can see where the different troops were stationed during the Battle of Antietam. General Ambrose Burnside replaced General McClellan, and he believed in the strategy of reckless attack, which unfortunately was not good. So in December 1862, the Union attacked Lee's army at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and ultimately suffered immense losses. 12,000 Union members were dead or wounded, and 5,000 Confederates were dead or wounded. Both the Union and Confederate generals were slow to learn that the improved weaponry, especially deadly fire from enemy artillery, took the romance out of heroic charges against the entrenched positions. This is when we see a change in how warfare is conducted because of the new modern weaponry. This is a map overview of the Battle of Fredericksburg. You can see around the Rappahannock River and the town of Fredericksburg. So it was a pretty spread out battle. In March of 1862, the Monitor versus Merrimac was a battle down in Hampton Roads. This was a part of the Anaconda Plan to blockade various ports. So the Confederate ironclad ship, the Merrimac, attacked and sunk several Union wooden ships on March 8, 1862, near Hampton Roads. Fun fact, the Merrimac was a former Union ship that was rebuilt and renamed the Virginia. On March 9th, the Union's ironclad, the Monitor, engaged in a 5-hour duel with the Merrimac. This ended in a draw and marked a turning point in naval warfare, with vulnerable wooden ships being replaced by ironclad ones. So this is an image of the Monitor versus the Merrimac. So remember, the Virginia was formerly a U.S. ship, the Merrimac, and then the Monitor is Union ship. In the West, Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant used a combination of gunboats and Army maneuvers to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which is a branch of the Mississippi. 14,000 Confederates were taken prisoner, and it basically opened the Mississippi to a Union attack. The Confederate Army under Albert Johnston surprised Grant at Shiloh, Tennessee, but the Union was able to hold its ground, and they forced the Confederates to retreat. 23,000 were dead and wounded on both sides. Grant's drive down the Mississippi, though, was complemented in April 1862 by the capture of New Orleans by the Union Navy under David Farragut. Yes, that's what Farragut Square in D.C. is named after. So you've got the Anaconda Plan working down through the West to take control of the Mississippi, especially with control of New Orleans. The Trent Affair. Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell were traveling to Britain on a British steamer, the Trent, on a mission to gain recognition for their government. A Union warship stopped the British ship, removed Mason and Slidell, and brought them to the U.S. as prisoners of war. Britain threatened war over the incident unless the diplomats were released. Britain came very close to siding with the Confederacy in late 1861 over an incident at sea. So this was the second incident, and Britain was really ticked off about it, so they were threatening that war. Lincoln ultimately gave in to British demands despite intense public criticism. So Mason and Slidell were set free, they sailed for Europe again, and they failed to obtain full recognition of the Confederacy from either Britain or from France. So the British did ultimately end up helping the Confederates to a certain degree by selling them more ships. So these Confederate commerce raiders did a lot of harm to U.S. merchant ships. The Alabama captured more than 60 vessels before being sunk off the coast of France by a Union warship. After the war, Great Britain eventually agreed to pay the U.S. $15.5 million for damages caused by the South's commerce raiders. The U.S. Minister to Britain, Charles Francis Adams, prevented a potentially much more serious threat. He learned that the Confederacy had arranged to purchase laird rams, which are ships with iron rams, from Britain for the use against the Union's naval blockade. Adams was able to persuade the British government to cancel this sale rather than risk war with the United States. Unfortunately for the South, cotton diplomacy failed. So King Cotton was how cotton plantations were known in the South. It was seen as this overarching theme that cotton ruled everything in the South. The South thought that the European countries would come directly to their aid because they just had to have the South cotton. Europe, on the other hand, quickly found ways of obtaining cotton from other sources, like Egypt and India. And they also discovered that materials other than cotton could be used for textiles, like wool and linen. Britain ultimately decided not to recognize the Confederacy for two main reasons. The first was General Lee's setback at Antietam, that there was no decisive Confederate victory, and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, which made the end of slavery an objective of the Union, which was a position that strongly appealed to Britain's working class. So ultimately, with the end of slavery, Lincoln spoke out against slavery in the 1850s as an unqualified evil, but as president, he seemed very hesitant to take action against slavery. He was really concerned about keeping the support of the border states, the constitutional protections of slavery that existed, the racial prejudice of a lot of Northerners, and the fear that premature action would be overturned in the next election. So he was very leery of doing anything specifically about slavery very early on in the war. Then came the Confiscation Acts. In May 1861, Union General Benjamin Butler refused to return captured slaves to their Confederate owners. He called them contraband of war at Fort Monroe. So thanks to that statement, in August 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act. Thousands of, quote, contrabands were using their feet to escape slavery by finding their way into Union camps. In July of 1862, Congress passed a second Confiscation Act that freed persons enslaved by anyone engaged in rebellion against the U.S. This allowed the president to use freed slaves in the Union Army in any capacity, including battle. And ultimately came the Emancipation Proclamation. In September, after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a warning that enslaved people in all states still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863, would be, quote, then, thenceforward, and forever free. So on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. It applied only to enslaved people residing in Confederate states outside the Union control. Consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation: it immediately freed only about 1% of slaves. Slavery in the border states was allowed to continue because they weren't in a rebellion. It enlarged the purpose of the war. For the first time, the Union armies were fighting against slavery, not just against secession and keeping the Union whole. This added weight to the Confiscation Acts that I just talked about, and with each advance of the Union troops into the South, the abolition advanced along with that line. These freed African Americans were allowed to enlist in the Union Army, and ultimately it discouraged any interference by foreign governments because they didn't want to touch the issue of slavery, especially if they had already gotten rid of it in their own countries. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks, which was about a quarter of the slave population, walked away from slavery to seek the protection of the approaching Union armies. Almost 200,000 African Americans, most of whom were newly freed slaves, served in the Union Army and Navy. They were segregated into all-black units like the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, and more than 37,000 soldiers died in the Army of Freedom. Many fought with distinction and were eventually paid salaries that were equal to that of white soldiers. Frederick Douglass was a former enslaved African American who became a prominent abolitionist during this time period. He urged Lincoln to recruit former enslaved African Americans to fight in the Union Army, and he was a major proponent for abolitionism before and during the war.